pronouns are he or they, and I identify as Vietnamese, I identify as American, I identify as non-binary, and I identify as queer, and I identify as an artist, as you can see. This is my art studio at Playhouse, and I'm currently an artist in residence here. And so thinking a lot about my Vietnamese heritage comes out a lot in my art process and in my artwork. I'm a visual artist. I work in painting, sculpture, fashion, and performance. And I also have a day job that works in videos and web content for a nonprofit. And so that nonprofit also works towards pedestrian safety, safe ways to get around that aren't revolved around a car. So those different things are some of the themes that I also incorporate into my artwork as well. Yeah, so this project is about refugees, refugee resilience, right? So thinking about that, so I was not a refugee, I was born in America, and I was born in Chattanooga, Tennessee. My parents were refugees, however, they left very soon after the war, and of course the backstory of their lives in Vietnam and our lives here in America I don't know very much about it in a lot of ways, and I actually had some of my first conversations about it last year with my father. So I'm 38 now, so that's 37 years of not knowing some of the history about, that formulated where I'm at now. So that a big question mark there. I luckily was visiting my father last year with a couple of my siblings, and we it was there for a wedding, and the energy was right, and so we were feeling very happy to see each other. He lives in Boston, so I don't see him as often. So it worked out very well because we stayed at Airbnb together, and so we had a chance to talk about that for the first time, really. And so I learned that, like other stories that I hear about as well, he was in the military, he was in the Navy, and essentially I learned about this wild, him learning about the fall of Saigon and learning that essentially there was no way he had to leave. And so for me it's scary to think about having to leave without saying goodbye. And so he walked me through kind of what he thought and getting on various boats and then making it to the Philippines and not being able to communicate with his family until months later. And so I found out that he got a plane and got a plane ride to America from there, landing in Arkansas at one of the refugee camps there. And he had not known my mother in Vietnam. And so that's also a weird thing to think about, right? Because not knowing the story, you fill in the story and you make assumptions about the story because you need to build some foundations about who you are. And so that was one of the assumptions that was kind of broken when he told me the story, because I wasn't sure if they had known each other before. But he met my mother through a mutual friend, and they did this very romantic letter writing thing between where they were at. He was eventually in New Jersey, so he was writing to my mother, and then he ended up meeting my mother and my two sisters in Michigan on the 4th of July. And I also think that's also a very fascinating concept, because me living in DC for the past 15 years, I kind of hate the 4th of July. It's quite annoying. It's like, it's a very tourist thing, you know, you don't want to be on the mall, you don't want to get stuck on the mall, and then there's also, as an artist, you think about what it means to be patriotic in a lot of ways, and there's a lot of disagreement with people who might come celebrate 4th of July in the National Mall with the thoughts of patriotism that I might have, and kind of the responsibility to disobedience in a lot of ways. But now I have this other memory, this other concept of the 4th of July. It's my father meeting my mother and the family kind of coming together for the first time. So yeah, so I'll be thinking about that one for a while. They eventually moved to Chattanooga, Tennessee, I think for a job that my father got. He was an engineer, and my mother had various jobs, but worked as like a seamstress for a while, owned her own hair salon as well. Chattanooga didn't have very many Vietnamese people, and so it was the classic task of assimilation, you know, versus diving deeper into the culture. I was raised speaking Vietnamese in the household, but now that I've moved away, a lot of those skills have eroded over time. So it's always interesting to see. So, you know, I've lost that confidence to speak Vietnamese, even though I can still understand a lot of Vietnamese, and it's always interesting as I'm now recently kind of re-engaging with the Vietnamese community, you know, what that feels like. And I'll get to that, I guess, in a little bit. Yeah, so Chattanooga was interesting. You know, assimilation is very much a survival tactic. You know, all these things can be happening around us, all these good things, all these awful things, and we still have to survive, and we still have to make it to the next day. And assimilation was one of those things. So it was interesting in Chattanooga, Tennessee, right, which is in the South, the southern states. There was this concept that, you know, to be, like, my parents put it under this kind of gaze of safety. It was like more safe to align with whiteness there. But really, I think it was an alignment with privilege. And so thinking about how in Chattanooga, the privileged class was white, and so by aligning values towards that ideal, there's also the counterbalance of, you know, anti-blackness. And so I just remember these distinctions growing up in Chattanooga. And then also my parents decided to, they got me into private school like when I was in 7th grade. So I went from public school, which is much more diverse snapshot of Chattanooga, to private school. A lot of rich white kids, you know. There's also like a boarding school, so people from all over the country, international. But those disparities just became were even more clear in that institution, in that academic institution. So yeah, I remember just survival mode was kind of what I, you know, leaned on to get through, and in a lot of ways that was a rejection of celebrating my heritage. You know, growing up, I got very annoyed when people found out that I was Vietnamese because of all the questions they asked, and the American concept of Vietnam is so tied to war, so tied to media. I felt like people were just prying too deep. You know, they found out I was Vietnamese, they wanted to know kind of all the things I talked about, like what happened to my family, were they from the north, were they from the south, you know, all these questions. And I was annoyed by that because it felt like to me maybe like a privacy thing, but really I didn't know where it came from. That's the honest truth. I had not had these deep conversations with my parents, so I didn't have those answers, and so I felt shame in those moments, and that shame kind of turned into some anger and like frustration, right? And so in a lot of ways, and all of those things just lead to just burying it down and be like, I'm not going to talk about this. All of those things happening in Chattanooga, basically led me to believe that Chattanooga was not for me. So when I could leave for college, I left. I have not moved back. And so by traveling to other parts of the country, I've met other Vietnamese people, other Asian people, which is also just a big difference as well. I went to school at Penn State University, which is surprisingly rural in some aspects, but I met just more Asian faces, and it was more normalized to think about my culture, my heritage in that way. After that, I moved here to DC. So after I graduated, I moved here in 2009. I really loved how easy the city is to walk around in and to get around in a lot of ways without having a car. Yeah, this is where I began my art journey as well. I started showing art in 2018, and a few things were very pivotal to that. And one of them is meeting my partner, Ashley J. Williams, who's also an artist in residence here. She's an artist, and so, when two artists make a life together, art becomes kind of a religion in a way, and so it sets this value system. Of course, coming with that, Ashley didn't have very many experiences that I had growing up. So one example is I was raised Catholic, but I don't consider myself Catholic anymore since I've left. But I made it all the way through the confirmation and through all the ceremony and all the masses and things like that. Those things Ashley was not raised with, so again, it's part of my choices to live where I am and live like I do is in some ways a rejection of some of the things I did that didn't really vibe with my value system and kind of these preordained, these sets of rules which I don't fundamentally agree with, but also that these rules that were very implicit and not explicit in a lot of ways, and so you couldn't, because they're implicit, you couldn't question them. So as an artist, I question everything, and so that's just one of the ways that it comes out, is re-questioning all my values, re-questioning everything related to my upbringing, everything related to my heritage. Yeah, so my art practice began by getting into the heritage in a lot of ways. There's like learning what happened to us is an important question, but in my art practice, the more important question for me is how do we live better, And so learning what happened to me is it revolves around my family's refugee story, but it also revolves around figuring out who I am and where I sit in that value system and that history. A lot of that comes out in my art. I mostly paint a lot of paintings that use myself, use people close to me as models. So a lot of times, especially in my early career, I would paint based on old family photos. I remember thinking about my father when he told me about his story in New Jersey. He had long hair, which I've gotten after the pandemic, and he was playing guitar, and so I have this painting at my home of him playing guitar and next to this tree, and just thinking about this romanticism about what's ahead, and he was really invested into this idea of the American dream, and this was before he met my mother, so all of these ideas of all this potential. So I really enjoyed painting things like that. I also went to Vietnam in 2019. This is my second trip. So I went once in 1996 with my family, and the second trip was just with friends. So it's a pretty big gap in time, and Vietnam has changed a lot in that time period. So I was thinking a lot about how kind of the difference between those visits, being on my own, not being fluent in the language, and that brought some anxiety about how the trip was going to go. And also going by myself, I was like, okay, am I going to feel something different in the motherland that I don't feel feel here, because here in America, Asian Americans, we have a lot of identity questions and a lot of identity complexes in a lot of ways because of how others treat us. And kind of the history of refugees is very aligned with the military history of America. Not only in America, but there's a lot of hesitations against immigration in general. And then America has this history where they make refugees, so all these conflicts, and then I guess they feel some shame or some responsibility, so they will bring some of the population over. A lot of similarities, Korean War, war in Vietnam, there's also Afghanistan, all these other populations ending up here due to military conflict. And so just thinking about that and thinking about how so as an Asian American, everyone thinks about how, I hear people say how appreciative we should be, right? How lucky we are that we're here. There is a privilege in that, but there's also a rage there. I am lucky to be where I am and fortunate to live the life that I live, but it's also circumstances out of my control made that happen, and I'm angry about it. And so it wasn't until very recently, and through the art is how I can express some of these feelings, but also to abstract them a bit, so doesn't feel so close to home in some ways. I think I'm constantly in a struggle with leading with vulnerability about myself, and then adding a layer of abstraction on top so that it becomes maybe universal in some ways, but it's also participatory. So people who look at the paintings can also participate. They can fill in things with their own experience, or see how it mirrors their own experience. And that's what I'm interested in the art. I want to bring up kind of themes of joy, themes of nonconformity, themes of the duality of being American. And that duality exists where I'm othered as an Asian American, but then I was made othered by this refugee military intervention, and so that's tough. That's a weird place to be in. So that's a summary of my experience here in America. So now I'm going to Vietnam. I'm like, okay, what is it going to be like there? Am I going to find belonging, right? So I remember going to Vietnam, and nobody thought I was Vietnamese. I don't necessarily know if it's because they don't think I'm Vietnamese at all, or if they just think that I'm American, But to me, I was like, no, nobody knows who I am. So that was interesting to process during that trip, but I feel like it was very necessary, because now I'm on the other side. Now I'm like, okay, there's no truth lying out there that I don't know about myself. I am who I am, and essentially the sooner I accept that, the better I'll be going forward. So after that trip, I thought a lot about the Vietnamese experience. Now I had another lens between Vietnamese experience in Vietnam, Vietnamese experience here. With the globalization, Vietnam is making a lot more money. So it's interesting because I met a lot of young Vietnamese people there. Also a lot of people know English there, so I was meeting a lot of people there, and they were talking about how, there's a lot more money now. So my mind goes to, okay, the more money that we get, the more power we get, the bigger our voices get. And so one of the big things is suppression of free speech there. And so, this Mai Khoi is someone I looked up when I was there. Unfortunately, couldn't go to a show when I was visiting, but I've luckily been able to come to have a relationship with Khoi and to become friends, and we actually had a performance of Khoi's here in Playhouse last month. And so Khoi's story was very inspiring because she gained popularity by being a musician in America. A lot. The funny thing is that artists can be. Her career shows how powerful art can be in politics, because at one point she had a very I love Vietnam song. The government really latched on to that, right? And so people can use art for propaganda, to facilitate harm potentially, right? It's not this very pure thing. So then she eventually, as she started to speak up for human rights, she ran for public office there, was banned from doing that. And so then then her art became more scrutinized over time. And so the censors had to approve anything she made before she could perform it publicly. And so then you see how the art can then scare politics in a way, right? It can be a force for politics or a force against in some ways. And so I'm very much thinking about that as well. She inspired me there, and thinking about what a life would have been like if I had grown up in Vietnam, and kind of doing a similar journey through art. Okay, this one behind me, it's called Open Mic, and MIC stands for Military Industrial Complex. And so this is a painting very much about DC, because DC, it's fairly liberal, fairly queer, very black, but we're not a state. We don't have any voting rights in Congress, but we're the home of Congress, right? So there's all these contradictions there. And so part of that is the military-industrial complex, and all of the, you'll meet all these federal contractors at happy hour or something, and they like to phrase it like they're a federal contractor, but what a lot of them are doing is supporting the military-industrial complex and supporting the creation and the selling of weapons, and conflict in Palestine also made me think of this painting, because I was thinking about how awful the genocide in Palestine has been now for so long. But I also was it's hard to make paintings, it's hard to make art about politics sometimes, because I'm not a politician. So I wanted to make something in response to this genocide, but I was trying to find what my lens would be. And so I narrowed it down to, I'm pissed off that the United States is sending weapons that are facilitating this genocide. And so by honing on that, that's what I came up with for this. This painting is, it's an interior painting kind of my bedroom. And that's my partner Ashley on top, I'm on the bottom. And I thought of this funny Washington Monument opening up, firing a missile into the world. That was kind of one of the first images in my mind. Also very much tied to humor. I feel like with surrealism, there's a tie with absurdity and humor that if you don't laugh, that you'll cry. So it's kind of based off those things. So there's a lot of missile imagery in this. There's a lot of elements of Vietnamese culture with the red envelope, the stool, some persimmons on the wall. And so this is an example of the contradictions that I feel sometimes, because also the acts of firing these missiles are very sexual, right? And so you can get pleasure in that. So there's this sexual chemistry as part of it, but it's also a horrible thing as well. And then there's scenes of DC in the background that I love. So there's Malcolm X Park and other little elements about why I love DC, but it's all surrounded by this cloud of that we live in this military-industrial complex. So that's one example of kind of how the heritage comes in, but how I like to abstract it, and how I like to tackle things that I feel like are relevant. This painting is called Vagabonds, and it features a couple of my very close friends are also Vietnamese. And so this one is also, so it's about solidarity there. It's also about queerness and thinking about, I guess kind of tying back to my Catholic upbringing, queer queerness has this history of social deviance, and it's like, yeah, it's like it's like very no with the church. And so kind of finding my relationships with my friends and who had similar experiences has been fun, because we can commiserate in a lot of ways. We have, some of the value system has stuck, but some of the things we don't necessarily agree with. So this is kind of a celebration of kind of the community we've made, and it's kind of poking fun at this idea of social deviance. So with like this very red wash, it's kind of like this party. One way you can look at it is like it's like this party that you want to be in, but it looks kind of dangerous. It could be like this transitional space with these, like, I have some like train motifs in there, so it could be about that. Vagabonds, I decided to name it that because to be a vagabond is to be in transition, and so I feel very much aligned with that as Vietnamese-American. Okay, so I also make portraits of my friends as well. I'm working on this big piece in the back. Is going to be the largest painting I've ever worked on, and I'm still figuring out what it'll be, but it gravitates around this idea about coming home. And so through my art journey and through therapy, I'm really working through these concepts of asking the questions, of normalizing asking the questions, making the implicit explicit, and diving into the heritage in a way that has less shame to it, and it's more exploratory, and it's more fun in that way. So this painting will have a lot of anthropomorphic symbolism. So I also use that as a metaphor for queerness. For example, I am obsessed with pigeons, because pigeons are they're very beautiful. They're iridescent. They're very large. They take up a lot of space. And they're very synonymous with cities, but in that same way, they're very invisible and very easy to ignore. And so I feel a lot of resonance with that feeling as a queer person. And so I have two of my friends there as pigeons, and so I'm using this anthropomorphic analogy to kind of show the strangeness, this weirdness that is ultimately just, each person is weird in their own way, and I want to celebrate that. And so I feel like, this painting will have a lot of different figures as different weird anthropomorphic creatures. And then my plan is to hang it from the ceiling here. So it'll hang down kind of like a bowl shape. So you'll see it, there'll be this one side you can see now is like the land side, and then on the other side of the bowl will be this underwater world. And so it's just a real meditation about kind of coming around to ideas of my heritage, my home, and my queerness kind of coming together. So that will be shown at the Queer Art Salon, which will be here in June. So I'm excited about that. Another big part of coming back to the heritage is my zine project, which is called Vagabond. I received a Wherewithal grant this year from the Washington Project for the Arts, which is also a re-granting program from the Andy Warhol Foundation. And so I received funding to make a zine about Vietnamese artists. And especially since kind of the pandemic, I've been meeting more and more Vietnamese artists in the art world here, exhibiting art, and it's been so great. And so I've kind of put together this cohort of 13 artists, including myself. There's other visual artists, there's poets, there's musicians, there's writers. I'm partnering with Philippa Hughes, we're kind of combining grants, which is another beautiful way to combine resources communally. She has a grant from the Commission on Arts and Humanities, and so we're combining grants. So she also has Vietnamese heritage, and so we interviewed all 13 artists, and we're going to put portions of that interview in the zine. And then we're also commissioning each artist to write a letter to their younger selves as an act of self-love. So also coming, me trying to share my feelings of self-love and kind of my importance of that, my value of that, and trying to promote that in others is kind of how this commission letter works. So the letters are very unique and very different, so that will be really interesting. And the interviews are good. They cover a lot of the similar topics. Philippa is very much invested. She's done like a video project. She's done a lot of discussions about identity, about American identity and Vietnamese identity. She identifies as half Vietnamese, so that's also another perspective. And so talking to the other artists, it's been really great because everyone has like these feelings of alienation and otherness, but by making this space together, I just remember how much fun these conversations are, and it feels good to come back into community with Vietnamese people in this new way, and with this acceptance that I'm an artist and I'm queer, and that may not have aligned with what I thought my heritage was, but I'm still here, right? And how do we live better in the future? And so by making space for all of these, I'm trying to make space for how expansive the identity is, not just like narrowing, And so I feel like when I was younger, the concept of being Vietnamese was a very narrow. I felt like people were like honing me, corralling me into this small box, and I hated it. And so the art is allowing me to expand that as much as possible. So I'm excited to share that. The zine will be out in June of 2024, and we're going to do a launch party where there's an outdoor exhibit space. It's called Lost Origins Outdoors, and it's in Mount Pleasant. And so it's this alley, and they make exterior photo prints. So we're going to print out portions of the zine and have them up all summer for that. So I'm really excited about that. It's also the first writing project I've done, so I've been really excited about that. I've been writing more poetry related to that, and I'm always inspired by, it's interesting, Vietnamese artists are there's a lot of gravitation towards writing. There's a lot of poets, Ocean Vuong and Viet Thanh Nguyen, a lot of writing about it, so I'm trying to also engage in that as well. The other part of that is I think that people don't necessarily recognize visual artists in this conversation, so I'm also trying to uplift that part of it as well, so that we can all have this dialogue together. Well, this whole process of writing a letter to my younger self, I can think about advice I'd tell myself. Advice for younger artists, I would say that making art is really about going deep, and it is about vulnerability, because if you're being vulnerable, you're sharing something that is very uniquely yourself, and that doesn't always feel good. It's like you can feel like you expose too much, you can feel like that you're sharing secrets in this way, but that's how you find out what you're made of, and that stems to the ideas. That's the root of the ideas that you can present to the world through your art. So I would just say, like, that journey is so crucial to finding out what makes your art unique and your unique perspective, because you could make a lot of art that's like, I guess commercial is the word, it lends to this capitalist society, and that's one choice, that's your choice. That's not the path that I've chosen. I'm choosing to make art that I don't make to sell in this way. Sometimes it does sell, and that's great, but it's really about sharing parts of myself by being vulnerable that I hope will affect you in some way. I don't know how exactly. Some people will hate it. Some people might feel something about their own lives differently, with a different perspective. So ultimately, that's kind of what I'm looking for, and that's what I consider good art, is that something that makes me think about something differently. And so, yeah, that would be my